Previously on the American Justice Podcast.
Because at first, I didn't have any inkling or any thoughts that he was that, I'm not going to say was or is, he's still innocent, was that type of person that would be capable of doing that type of crime because of his personality trait.
And what personality trait is that?
Well, timid, homosexual, and female.
Okay.
He's feminine. He shaves his legs, he shaves his arm, he shaves his chest. I mean, some weird shit.
He's doing that down there?
Yeah.
Okay.
You don't do that shit in jail.
There is an epidemic in America's criminal justice system. The prosecution and conviction of innocent people for crimes they did not commit. Welcome to American Justice. The American Justice Podcast Army works to free men and women wronged by the criminal justice system. It's not only about the innocent who have been imprisoned, but also the victims of the crimes as well. No one deserves justice more than them. And now, here's your host, Scott Pogensy.
Welcome back, AJ Army. I am absolutely ecstatic to be in your presence once again. As we draw near to the end of Season 1, I find myself more and more honored that you have taken time out of your busy day to listen to me talk about something that, more than likely, most of you have never heard of before. And you could be anywhere in the world, and you are choosing to be right here with me. I appreciate that more than you can ever know. And I look forward to bringing you many more seasons of the American Justice Podcast. Just one quick update before we begin. If you will remember from last week, I had issues that needed to be checked with Brandon's attorneys on the phone records issue. Good news, I have clearance and everything we talk about today has been approved. Now, there are a couple things that are going into the appeal that we will not be able to talk about. But we will still be able to talk about a lot of it. So here we go. Day 10, State of Texas versus Brandon Dale Woodruff, Court Reporters Volume 49. Ranger Collins. The man is so grand, he just had to have a sequel. If you were me, and you've been reading court transcripts of this trial for years and years, you just can't seem to get rid of him. He's like that gunked up penny in a pocket full of change that just keeps popping out every single time you need to pay for something. So let's begin with his second day of testimony. They begin the day by discussing Mike Etherington's false claims from Brandon's MySpace page. Ah, MySpace. Did you know that MySpace kept no permanent records of anything being said back in those days? Doesn't it make you wish that you could go back to that time and really tell someone off? That should really have been something that they brought to your attention in 2005. I would have really given Tom a piece of my mind. Still, Mike's information he offered the investigators was third-hand information and only touched on briefly in court. The biggest concern from Ranger Collins was that he used it in the arrest affidavit, and the lie had his name attached to it. I can almost assure you that he became quite the social media expert over the past 15 years. So be careful. He could be that one friend request in your Facebook inbox who you have no mutual friends with. He goes on to read through his report stating that Grandmother Bonnie was highly upset during the big family reveal at the Hunt County Sheriff's Office and tried to convince everyone, him included, that he was looking at the wrong person. She flat out revealed her opinion that Charla should have been a person of interest in the case. No worries, Bonnie. I know a couple of people who would completely agree with you. Well, more than a couple, but you get the point. Ranger Collins states that he never thought Charla was a suspect. Like, never. Not once. Not even after the self-admission of how much her dad beat her, how she tried to commit suicide with a gun, how she passed out whenever it was convenient for her, even after, well, you know the rest of the story. He goes on to state that her whereabouts the night of the murders was verified by the phone records. At least, the whereabouts of her phone was verified by the phone records. We're all aware by now that the records were incomplete and inconclusive. And as we will go into later when we talk about these inconclusive phone records, just because her phone was in Magnolia does not mean that she was. The prosecution goes over Brandon's credit card records with Collins, only to reveal that Brandon was a typical, financially irresponsible teenager, just like the rest of us were at age 19. If you were lucky or unlucky enough to have a credit card, that is. They dive even deeper into some of Brandon's email history from ACU, verifying to the jury that he was a horrible college student as well in regards to attendance. Still, not paying your bills and skipping class does not make you a murderer. Only murder does that, and they have yet to prove absolutely anything about the actual murders. Then they read an email where an excuse was given that Brandon was receiving his mother's truck for his birthday. Yeah, well, I used to say some off-the-wall shit to my teachers to get out of assignments too. Brandon was an excessive exaggerator, but that still doesn't make him a murderer. The prosecution describes them as SOS emails from the staff attempting to assist him with getting back on track in school. Now, after mentioning it days before, the prosecution shows the Channel 11 interview to the jury.
Then I'm going to ask a very direct question. Did you or did you not murder your parents?
I did not.
It was no secret that Brandon wasn't a big fan of the Royce City mobile home, but not for the reasons that his haters claimed. It wasn't beneath him, it was just scary. When the defense takes over, they attempt to establish that Brandon was upfront and truthful when he discussed his times and his whereabouts with Ranger Collins during that initial interview. Collins replies that, well, it depends on what your definition of truth is. I'm sure Ranger Collins doesn't know what the definition is, so maybe the defense can help him along with that. But then Katie reminds Ranger Collins that he was once a teenager himself. I don't think it's impossible to deny that. I mean, we all had to start somewhere. Frankly, I find the image of teenage Jeffrey Collins reading cowboy comics underneath his covers with a flashlight to be slightly humorous. At least, that's what we hope he'd be doing under there. That's what I'll run with for the sake of my sanity. Comic books. Collins claimed that his own teenage children were always 100% accurate about their times and whereabouts because he makes them be that way. I'm calling bullshit. I knew a lot of cops' kids when I was growing up, and some of them were the absolute worst when it came to being law-abiding citizens. He said he didn't personally know anyone else in the entire world with teenage children to use as a basis of comparison, but agreed that several teenagers that he'd investigated in the past were off on their personal timelines as well. Ferguson goes on to lead Collins through Brandon's self-admitted whereabouts and timeline, and he agrees that they're mostly accurate. Now, after all, he never had to pry any of this information out of Brandon. It was all information that Brandon freely offered up without any hesitation. Next, Mike Etherington becomes the topic of discussion along with that heated interview from a dozen episodes ago where Collins says that he wants to strangle him.
I hate to tell you this, Mike, but I'm just about ready to strangle you. You know what I mean?
I understand 100%.
And I just want to step out for just a moment, and I just want to regain my composure. I don't want to raise my voice to you. I just want to interview you. I just want to get as much information as I can.
I'm a very disciplinary kid.
And I need to kind of step back for just a moment and just you talk to him and just...
She reminds Collins that Todd Williams warned him about Etherington during his statements. He goes on to deny ever accusing Todd Williams of having an inappropriate homosexual relationship with Brandon, even though it's written right there in his own investigative report. She hands Collins a ruler to measure the length of the sword and asks him if it's a, quote, man thing to wrongfully overestimate size. As a man, I'll be honest enough to say that it totally is a man thing. Hey, don't judge. We've all done it. Ferguson does, however, reveal a flaw in his logic. If one of the college students gave false information, it was because, they were a teenager. If Brandon gave any kind of false information, it was because he was a diabolical liar. He goes on to defend his decision to film the crime scene in the dark so that the defense, the prosecution, and the jury could see the footage in the way that it was viewed by the initial responders. Also, if that's the case, it was found by the initial investigators around 3 to 4 p.m. So it still would be light outside, right? I mean, I think Alaska is the only state where it stays dark at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. How about videotaping it the way that the crime allegedly went down? I don't remember anyone saying that they thought the Woodruffs were murdered in the dark by candlelight. I just find it funny that Ranger Collins even has the audacity to try and defend this decision. It's one thing to just say, you know what, I'm sorry, I screwed up. But it's another thing to defend the decision that we all know was wrong in the first place. Also, who said it was initially a crime? What if he'd have gotten there and it was determined to be a murder-suicide? There would be no defense, no prosecution, and no jury to show it to. Nice try, Lone Ranger. Nice try. Collins goes on to say that he believed the hair in Norma's right hand could have possibly identified the real perpetrator, but never bothered having it analyzed. Yeah, no shit, Sherlock. He also fully agreed that Brandon wasn't the only person with access to the Lee's poor choice of gun/art, and that Mike Etherington had access to it on multiple occasions as well. Also, he agreed that the water found in the bathtub could not have been from the last time that Brandon was actually in his parents' home. The investigation team took no DNA swabs from anyone other than Brandon and Charla at the request of Super Trooper Texas Ranger Jeff Collins, who insists on doing it with the lights off. Also, there was no DNA testing performed on Dennis and Norma's couch to see if the true killer or killers possibly injured themselves during the horrendous attack. Finally, he had no explanation how the blood of Dennis Woodruff was found on the suspected murder weapon and not Norma's as well. Same here, Jeffy boy. Same here. With Collins off the stand and on his way to bigger and brighter future, James Nichols, a forensic scientist for the DNA section of DPS, takes his place. He explains his version of DNA for dummies to the jury, and away we go with what we already understood. Dennis and Norma's blood was all over the crime scene. Someone get this man an overstuffed teddy bear from the top shelf. Contrary to popular belief from the investigators stumbling around in the dark on that October night in 2005, There were no positive hits for blood in the hallway or in the bathrooms of the Royce City home. Too bad the investigators weren't wearing protection over the boots to prevent mucking up the scene in front of the sofa. Hell, too bad they didn't test the sofa. I tell you, if incompetents were airplanes, the murder scene would have been considered an international airport. Day 11, State of Texas versus Brandon Dale Woodruff, Court Reporter, Volume 50. Fortunately, James Nichols wasn't able to finish his testimony in time, and he got to spend the night in the bustling metropolis of Greenville, Texas. So he takes his place on the stand the next morning. I can only imagine the fun that he had while perusing the local Walmart and, well, perusing the local Walmart. That's really all there is to do there. That and get pregnant. I can see why he chose Walmart. Writer's note. Oh yeah, just in time. C. Derek Miller saves us with a writer's note. Just to prove how intertwined the threads of Hunt County truly are, an officer by the name of Kimberly Fannin helped handle the, quote, sword/dagger/knife in the Hunt County evidence room in 2008. She is my aunt. Brandon Bobbitt, the evidence guy from 2005, is my cousin. Although the two of them are not related, everyone in that place seems to be related in one way or another. I am the bridge, I guess. Just wanted to be open and honest in case anyone comes along and claims that I'm biased. End writer's note. Nichols claimed the DNA of Dennis Woodruff could not be excluded from beneath the decorative skull of the sword in any way, but he did agree that the skull was close enough to the handle that it could have originated from the hand of the person who was holding the weapon. Was this blood from an earlier incident in which Dennis was holding the sword/magic dagger? Perhaps wrapping it up and placing it to be packed away in the barn prior to the murders. Mr. Nichols was also highly confused as to why a mixture of DNA from both Dennis and Norma did not appear there from when they were both stabbed. We'll get to it in the wrap-up episode, but I personally don't think that sword was ever in the barn in 2005. But you'll just have to come back around in a few weeks when we go over all of that. With Nichols stepping down, the prosecution rests. Now, what is normally just considered a procedural motion, the defense team asked Judge Beacom to make what's called an instructed verdict, since the prosecution has been unable to prove the crime of murder. I say what is normally considered a procedural motion because 99 times out of 100, it's denied. However, in this particular case, I believe that Judge Beacom had the information to grant the motion. I mean, after all, the prosecution seriously has not proven anything when it comes to the actual murder. They may have kind of possibly inferred a plausible motive with their shotgun approach to motives, but having a motive to kill someone and actually killing them are two different things. Hell, I've had the motive to kill a few dozen people in my life, but I have not, as of yet, actually killed anyone. Seriously, though, up until this point, everything has been guesswork and speculation. No one has been able to prove anything at all within a reasonable doubt. However, of course, Judge Beacom denies the motion, because that's what cranky old men in robes do. They say no to almost everything. Well, at least almost everything the defense asks for. Okay, so after Judge Beacom denies the motion, after 2 weeks of the prosecution taking shots in the dark, the defense gave their opening statement. As mentioned at the beginning, the defense giving their opening statement after the prosecution rests is an option. It's not really exercised that often because you want to give the jury things to think about during the prosecution's case in chief. However, there's just as much of an argument to be made that after the prosecution rests, now you can stand up and tell the jury what they just heard from the prosecution was all bullshit. And Katherine does just that. She reminds the jury that the prosecution claimed that Brandon Woodruff's lies had finally caught up to him, when in fact the lies in the case had finally caught up to the state. She introduces the upcoming defense witness list in an attempt to show them all that Brandon is not guilty. There's a lot more to it, but she says a lot of the stuff that she says in her closing statement, so we'll save it until then. The defense calls a lady by the name of Tammy Keel to the stand. She claims to have been Brandon's second mother. They had met many years ago at the ranch where she and Brandon boarded their horses. To her knowledge, Brandon drove Norma's truck all the time without Norma in it, and did not find this as strange at all that he had the truck the night the Woodruffs were murdered. She also verified the fact that Brandon's own truck had broken down on him several times, stranding him and placing him in uncomfortable situations. Brandon being seen without a shirt or socks on was also something that was not unusual to her. She said that Brandon was just like that, and she would not be the last person to claim that as well. She also claimed to have received a phone call from Brandon around 7 p.m. on the night of the murders, and they discussed something that was going on with one of Norma's horses. She said that he had actually been out there at the horse stables on that Sunday morning. After the death of Dennis and Norma, her observation of Brandon was that of a distraught teenager who was in constant shock. She also observed him being very upset at his parents' funerals, which was contradictory to everything said before by those who claimed that Brandon was guilty. She did agree that the boy became less, quote, Western and more, quote, Calvin towards the end of his senior year, but found no fault in it. Miss Keel says that she never heard him say anything negative or venomous towards Dennis or Norma, and even overheard Norma saying her truck would belong to him if his grades were good enough. Yes, that truck. The truck. The same damn truck we've been hearing about for 20-something episodes now. The one that he wasn't supposed to drive, quote unquote. The one Charla sold because she didn't feel right driving it, etc., etc. Yes, that truck. Oh my God. It turns out it was intended to be Brandon's truck after all. We really got to start getting these people on the same page. Next, a lady by the name of Grace Jackson took the stand. She knew Brandon from the horse ranch as well. She also knew Brandon to drive Norma's Chevy truck whenever he came out to the ranch to care for the horses. More and more people who knew the Woodruffs well and interacted with them regularly were revealing things that their own daughter and the family in Texarkana were completely clueless about. Since she claimed never to have met Norma or Dennis, this meant that Brandon drove the truck alone regularly. Again, this is contradictory to everything presented by the prosecution's witnesses. But isn't that how courtrooms work? Grace Jackson sold one of Brandon's horses shortly after he arrived at ACU, which put him in possession of quite a bit of money, thousands of dollars to be exact. Perhaps this is how he was able to wine and dine all of his friends in college. Did anyone ever stop to think that maybe he was just a nice, generous guy? That perhaps all of his high school friends betrayed and shit on him before leaving home, and that he was willing to do just about anything to make a name for himself and live a new life and basically become an entirely new person? Still, she too was present during several phone calls between Brandon and his parents and claimed the conversations were always in good spirits. No bad blood at all. Nothing but love between them. Dr. Joy Carter now takes the stand. She was board certified in anatomical pathology, clinical pathology, and forensic pathology. Basically, much smarter than everyone else in the courtroom who just argues stuff for a living. At one time, she was the Deputy Chief Medical Examiner of the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System in Washington, D.C. Now, I know Washington, D.C. doesn't have the best of reputations here in the year 2020, but in 2005, it was still the same old Washington, D.C. we've known since we were children. You could actually believe about 50% of the things spoken from politicians back then. Can you believe that? Dr. Carter had been on the faculty of numerous universities and was published countless times. Through her investigations, she had discovered faults in several forensics labs throughout Texas, including the one responsible for the autopsies of Dennis and Norma Woodruff. She stated they had a tendency to abuse case evidence. Dr. Carter had been used as a records reviewer in hundreds of cases over the years and thought that the fact that the Woodruffs' clothes had not been examined after the murders was a huge misstep on their part. Wait a second. Are you saying that in a knife attack, where there was almost a statistical certainty that the perpetrator cut themselves and probably bled on Dennis and Norma's clothes as they were ruthlessly stabbing them, that there might be the DNA from the perpetrator on their clothes? God, what it must be like to be someone with more than half a brain. No wonder she never worked in Hunt County. Dr. Carter claimed that Dennis and Norma's autopsies were not completed correctly, and the reports documenting the facts were full of assumptions. Most importantly, she claimed that the sword/magic dagger/supposed murder weapon could not have caused the wounds on Dennis and Norma. Their wounds were consistent with a blade that only had one sharp edge like a kitchen knife or a hunting knife. She also believed that the wounds were not all caused by the same weapon, and that multiple bladed weapons were used. Also, the marks on Dennis and Norma made by the hilt of the weapon led her to believe the blade used to kill them was much, much shorter than the weapon in question. To her, it would be difficult to determine an exact murder weapon due to the way that the medical examination was completely botched from the very beginning. Dr. Carter supposed that the hairs in Norma's hand were not tested due to a lack of funds rather than in the interest of justice. The prosecution attempted to discredit her during their cross-examination since she had only viewed the reports rather than attended the actual autopsies. Also, they even grasped at some straws by mentioning a previous wrongful termination lawsuit from some of her former employees as the Harris County Chief Medical Examiner. This is the first time in the transcript that I feel any sense of desperation from the prosecution side of things, and I can't help but feel as though they thought, if only for a second, the whole thing might just slip away from them. I mean, hell, if you can't argue with her science, just do your best to try and discredit her. It turns out, though, that the wrongful termination suits had no merit and were eventually dismissed. But don't let that stand in the way of the prosecution's Hail Mary. Now that the prosecution caught their breath and changed their underwear, Todd Williams takes the stand. It's been a while since we've spoken about him, so I'll remind you. He was Brandon's mentor, friend, and the person who originally discovered Dennis and Norma's bodies after their deaths. He, too, claimed Brandon drove Norma's truck regularly. Why is this split down the middle so perfectly? Depending on whose side you were on, Brandon either did or did not drive that damn truck. Todd told the jury that Norma Woodruff believed that Mike Etherington was responsible for poisoning their family dog, and she warned Brandon to stay far away from him for his own well-being. One more thing Brandon said that was backed up by independent sources. Todd said that he viewed Brandon as someone who was totally lost upon receiving the news about Dennis and Norma's death. Understanding that he was someone who knew the teenager well, and on a near daily basis, he would definitely be someone who could determine the boy's mental state at the time. He told Brandon that he was the man of the family now, and that it would be his responsibility to look after his sister, Charla. Now hold up, Mr. Williams. Let's not jump the gun and do anything rash. As we've discussed earlier in the season, Charla was certainly capable of taking care of herself. Well, of course, that would depend on which side of the bipolar Charla you were talking to at the time. Todd says that he was never contacted for an interview by the Hunt County Sheriff's Department, so he chose to seek them out instead. Ranger Collins wasn't interested in any of his information or advice, and even went as far as to accuse him of having an inappropriate homosexual relationship with Brandon. Collins attempted to intimidate him at every turn. Whether or not Ranger Collins says that that was his intention is irrelevant. That's the way that Todd took it. So maybe Collins should have just kept his homophobic trap shut. Someone is coming to you with information that shows that the person that you have in custody is possibly not the person that actually committed the crime. And you just intimidate him and tell him that people are saying that he is the reason that Brandon's gay? An upstanding heterosexual member of the community? I think sometimes police and investigators lose sight of the fact that they were there to protect and serve. This is a member of his community that pays taxes, which in turn pays Ranger Collins' salary. He is beholden to Todd Williams, not the other way around. But damn, no wonder Todd won't talk to me. Maybe someday, when God gives him a sign, he will. Until then, Ranger Collins needs to repent for his sins. Okay, so Todd also claimed that both Brandon and Charla were highly medicated during the funerals, and that was why Brandon seemed so distant to everyone else. Both Dennis and Norma were well aware of Brandon's shortcomings in school, and they'd spoken to him about it directly on several occasions. He truly believed that Brandon Woodruff loved his parents with all of his heart and was innocent of the crime in question. Although he was thought to be an evil turd, Williams didn't believe that Mike Etherington was capable of the murder either. His mother, Norma Etherington, was a different subject altogether. Ironically, she had the same color of hair as that found clutched in Norma's hand upon her death. But we already knew that. But it was nice of Todd to point it out to the jury, not that they were listening anyways. Okay, so last up for day 11 is Todd's wife, Tracy. She took the stand after Todd, but really couldn't offer up much information that would make any difference in the eyes of the jury. As you heard earlier, the majority of them had their minds made up from day one of jury selection. She couldn't recall which vehicle Brandon drove back and forth to the FFA barn, but she did know all about the discord between Norma Woodruff and Norma Etherington. Norma Woodruff had spoken to her about it personally. She claimed that the Woodruff family had an extremely strong bond and couldn't imagine how their son Brandon could have done something as horrendous as this. We couldn't agree with you more, Tracy. All right, so that brings day 11 to a close. Day 12, State of Texas versus Brandon Dale Woodruff, Court Reporter, Volume 51. Ronald Fazio takes the stand outside of the presence of the jury because his credentials are unverified. He's the lab director for Integrated Forensic Laboratories and uses computer programs to determine the trajectories of bullets and other totally cool stuff like that. Any information he gave was coming directly from the medical examiner's reports, so the prosecution did not think much of his testimony. He believed that Charles Clow, the ballistics expert, the gentleman who testified earlier in the trial for the prosecution, came to his conclusions by using nothing but a photograph. No physical measurements were taken at the crime scene to determine any of the bullet trajectories. As a matter of fact, the majority of his professional testimony is contradictory to that of Charles Clow in every way. Nothing claimed by the prosecution's witness was determined to be accurate with any amount of scientific certainty. After that, a lady by the name of Eulalia Glover comes to the stand for the defense. She worked with Brandon at Chism Feed, but doesn't offer up much of anything factual other than Brandon's driving of Norma's truck from time to time whenever the family would purchase feed for their animals. I'm so damn sick of this truck, and I'm personally glad that Charla sold it. Again, her personal observation was that the Woodruffs were a loving family. All right, now comes the moment we've all been waiting for. The defense forensic expert for the phone records takes the stand, Mr. John Miner. At the time, he worked for Atwater Enterprises. He is a certified signal analyst. He is called by the defense to re-review the cell phone records. He claims that the cell records are totally incomplete and inconclusive. Yeah, we knew that, John. He reconstructs the phone records using multiple sources in a way that law enforcement did not. Remember, the state failed to get Brandon's phone records from around 8:54 a.m. until 10:46 p.m., that call that pinged off of the cell tower in Mesquite on the way to Denny's. That's exactly 13 hours and 52 minutes completely missing. So let's talk about Brandon's phone records before we get into Charla's and the shit kickers. Mr. Miner presents a map he's created to the jury showing an accurate timeline and location for Brandon. Now you might wonder, if there's almost 14 hours missing from Brandon's records, then how was he able to do this? Luckily for us and the defense, Ranger Collins actually did get other people's phone records related to the case. The exhaustive list would be Morgan Lee, Robert Martinez, Alex Ruley, Mike Etherington, and all of the Woodruffs, Charla, Brandon, and Dennis and Norma's cell phones and their home phone. I still don't understand why he didn't get Joe Hageman's and Dustin Perry's phone records, but he did not. Even if he didn't request them in the beginning, I think we've showed enough of a reason that he could have gotten them and should have gotten them after the fact. Okay, so what John Miner did was use other people's phone records to construct when Brandon called them. For example, all those times that we know that he called Robert or Robert called him were reconstructed using Robert's phone records. So we know what times Brandon had conversations with his parents, Robert, Alex, Charla, and Morgan. What is very important to understand, though, is that since we don't have Brandon's records, if he called someone else during those times, we would not know about it. For example, we have been able to determine that Brandon was, quote, unaccounted for during the golden hour of opportunity for exactly 14 minutes, right? Well, what if he would have called his dorm RA during that time? Or maybe he would have called his ex-boyfriend Doug, etc. We would have absolutely no idea about those calls because of the fact that the state failed to get Brandon's records. But if he did make any calls during that 14 minutes, then obviously the 14 minutes would become a lot less. Okay, so through some actual investigation on Mr. Miner's part, It showed 25 calls between Brandon and different people between 8:50 p.m. and 11:22 p.m. Doesn't sound like someone that's actively committing capital murder to me. Unless, as Katherine Ferguson said, they want us to believe that he was making calls, putting his phone away, shooting his parents, bringing the phone back out, making more calls, putting it away, stabbing his parents, taking the phone back out. Okay, well, you get the point. Obviously, it's ridiculous to even suppose such a thing. So let's take a look at the actual hour the prosecution said Brandon was unaccounted for. We know that it wasn't an hour, it was only 14 minutes, but they say in their closing that Brandon was unaccounted for between 9:30 and 10:30 p.m. In that hour, Brandon made or received 10 calls for an average of 2 minutes a call. That's 20 of the 60 minutes that he spent actually on the phone. Now let's talk about driving between the houses, driving to Denny's, etc. It's just one more way of looking at Brandon's records to show how ridiculous this whole thing really is. No wonder the prosecution did not want us to see the full phone records. Too bad for them, though. We got most of them another way. All right. Now, Mr. Minor talks about Mike Etherington's phone records, and they actually showed something very interesting that we'll cover now, but we'll also cover it again in a little more detail on the wrap-up show. Now, listen to me very carefully. This is very important. If you're driving, you might want to pull over. Well, okay, you don't have to pull over, but just make sure that you don't get in a wreck. At 7:39 p.m., Mike received a phone call. This was a 5-second call from fellow shit kicker Dustin Perry. Now, that's not like a voicemail picked up and Dustin didn't want to leave a message, so he just hung up. This is an answered call for 5 seconds. Who knows what they talked about for 5 seconds, but Mike got one more call from Dustin at 9:35 p.m. This call was for 2 minutes. Remember, Mike told Ranger Collins that he left his girlfriend's house around 9:30 and was home by 10 p.m. and then asleep by 12:30 a.m. at the latest.
Where were you on Sunday the 16th?
Sunday the 16th, I was at my girlfriend's house, came home, and went to bed. So
All day you were at your girlfriend's house?
I usually ask her once I go to her house, and the time I'm supposed to be out of her house on school nights is 10 o'clock. And here lately now that I'm having to wake up at 6:30 every morning, I'll be out of her. I'll be like, baby, I'm getting tired. I need to go home. It'll be like 9:30 that I'm telling her that. Now hold on.
What?
Well, here's the problem. Mike said that he had a routine of following his girlfriend's curfew, and then they would get on the phone together after he would leave her dad's house. So, you might be thinking, okay, well, how long did they talk? You know me better than that. They did not. They did not talk. That call from Dusty at 9:35 p.m. for 2 minutes was the last call Mike made or received until that 1:59 a.m. call. So where was this conversation with his girlfriend? Why would he lie about that? And what was he talking with Dusty about around the same time he left his girlfriend's house? I think I know what that conversation was about, but you'll have to wait for the wrap-up show to hear my opinion. Now, I have to admit that when I first read that Mike had this one call with Dusty at 9:35 p.m. and then radio silence until that 1:59 a.m. call, I found it quite odd. One of the things the police will tell you when investigating potential suspects, go off of their history and then see if the night in question differs from the established pattern. Since most of you are inquiring minds and amateur sleuths just like me, you might have thought to yourself, how many times has he gone from 9:35 p.m. to the next morning without any phone calls? I'm glad you're right along with me on this one. Luckily for us, we have Mike's phone records from October 10th to October 31st. Unfortunately, Ranger Collins only put in the order getting the phone records of everyone that he wanted October 10th to the 31st. It seems to me that a real investigator might want to look at the activity of someone in a month or two leading up to the murders, and maybe even a month or two after, at the very least. Yet, here we are, 21 days of phone records for everyone. Some phone companies just got lazy, I guess, and went ahead and sent over the whole month of October, so we do have more than that for some people, but not everyone. Mike had Verizon back then, and they only sent over what the order from the court asked for. Okay, so I went back through all 21 days, and the only time that he ended his phone calls at 9:35 p.m. or before until the next day was, drum roll please, 0. Yeah, for those of you that guessed 0, you got it right. This was the only night that he stopped talking at 9:35 p.m. or before. In fact, I believe Mike when he says that he normally went to bed around 12:30 a.m. Most of the nights, the calls stopped between 11:30 p.m. and 12:30 a.m. All right, so let's look at that 1:59 a.m. call the night of the murders next. John Miner relays to the jury that it was a 2-minute and 22-second call from Mike's phone to his girlfriend. Again, as we already know, this call was made on a cell tower close to the Woodruff's house. It was approximately 3 miles from the Woodruff's place and almost 10 miles from Mike's house. If you're watching on the YouTube channel, I'm going to go ahead and put up a graphic on the screen to show you exactly how far away these two places were. If you're not watching on YouTube, I'll put it up on the website under the case files. You can check it out there. The prosecution tried to say that the cell tower near Mike's house was busy and relayed the call for some reason, but I think we've already explained to you why this is bullshit. Also, remember that Mike never said anything to Ranger Collins about this phone call. As far as he was concerned, he was at home asleep all night long after 12:30 a.m. So of course the question has to be asked, what was Mike doing in Royce City at 1:59 a.m.? I'll let you be the judge. All right, let's move on to Charla's phone records. I know that's what everybody's been waiting for. This is some interesting stuff right here. Again, with Charla, we only have 21 days worth of information. But my, what a 21 days it is. All right, let's first start with Charla's claims that she was, quote, worried out of her mind about her parents. All right, I want you to imagine for just a minute. You told your mom at 9:30 p.m. that you would call her when you got home at 11 p.m. You call at 11 p.m. and she doesn't answer. What would you do? Would you call again? Would you chalk it up to, oh, I guess she just fell asleep? Okay, if you said the latter, I'll go along with you on that one. It seems reasonable. I personally might call one more time just to make sure it didn't get crossed in the cell towers, but I'll agree it's reasonable to assume that she fell asleep and move on. Also, remember, Charla told Ranger Collins that she talked to her parents almost every day, so don't forget to add that into your equation. Okay, so you call the next day, and once again, your mom doesn't answer. What to do, what to do. How many times would you call that day? Remember, you talk to your mom almost every day. And your parents have that thing that was popular in the early 2000s where the number that you call rings to all the phones, the cell phones, the home phone, until someone picks up. So how many times would you call that day? Personally, I think I'm starting to get pretty worried at this point. So then you don't get a hold of either of your parents that day, no matter how many times you called. What would you do the next day? How many times would you call that day? We'll call that day 3, since technically the missed call at 11 p.m. would be day 1. So by the third day, how many times are you calling? What are you going to do? Are you going to get in the car and drive over there to your parents' house? Are you going to keep calling over and over and over again until they answer? What would you do? Okay, got it? All right, let's see what Charla did. So we all know that Charla called her mom on Sunday night, the 16th at 11 p.m. and Norma didn't answer. That was the only call that night. But we all decided that was okay, and we're giving her a pass on that day, day 1. Now, day 2 comes around. Let's see when she called. Had to be in the morning, right? She had 2 individual calls and 1 cluster of calls. 5:32 p.m., Norma's cell. 6:33 p.m., home phone. 9:33 p.m., she calls the home phone, Dennis's cell phone, and Norma's cell phone back to back. I call that a cluster. So then, this is now Monday night. This is the night that Charla decided to go out and get drunk with her friends. To her credit, when she was talking to Ranger Collins, she says that she thought if she called in the middle of the morning, her parents would realize that something was wrong with their college student daughter and would definitely answer. So she calls another cluster at 1:58 a.m. All right. So we have those calls so far. Still nothing. No word from her parents whatsoever. Let's head into day 3. By this time, remember Charla says that she was beside herself. She didn't know what to do with herself. So you're thinking, bam, 6 a.m. phone call, right? Nope. How about 1:45 p.m.? She calls the home phone and Dennis's cell phone. I'm not sure why she skipped her mom's phone that time, but it is what it is. All right, 2:45 p.m. Charla's getting industrious. She's starting to think outside the box. She calls Dennis's work. This is the conversation where they tell her, your dad hasn't been to work in 2 days now. So 2:58 p.m., she calls the cluster again, all 3 phones. So just to wrap it up, she called Dennis's work once, 2 individual calls, and 4 clusters of calls. I don't know about you, but if I'm worried sick about my parents, I'm calling over and over and over and over again. But maybe that's just me. I'll leave it up to each one of you to determine if you feel like this is reasonable or not. Now, on to the next suspicious thing about Charla's phone records. By looking at the end of the last call of the night and the first call of the next morning, Charla did not seem to get much sleep. In fact, the average time between those 2 calls is just a little over 4 hours. That means that the typical night for her ended around 2 to 3 a.m. and calls started right back up usually around 6 to 7 a.m. It makes sense though. I mean, she's a college student after all. Early bird gets the worm, right? But let's take a look at the night of the murders. That Sunday night, her last call was 12:29 a.m. when she called her boyfriend for 52 seconds. Probably just to say goodnight, I would assume. Then there's one call at 3:15 a.m. for 5 minutes. We'll leave that call right there and come back to it in just a minute. The very next call is 11:42 a.m. when Charla calls her boyfriend again. So not counting that 3:15 a.m. call, the time between her last call the night before and her next call the next morning was 11 hours and 13 minutes. The reason I say we're not going to count that call at 3:15 a.m. is because the person that called her had never called her before. She did talk to that person a lot after this 3:15 a.m. call, but never before. At least, not according to the phone records that the diligent Ranger Collins decided to ask for. She could have called before this 21 days, but who knows? Remember when I said it might be important to get more than 21 days worth of records? This is why. Is it impossible that the person talked to Charla before? Of course not. But not with the information that we have available. Maybe Charla should come on and tell us who this person is and how she knows them, and how many times she's talked to them. All right, so again, I want you to take your own experiences into account here. If you have never talked to someone before, are you going to call them at 3:15 in the morning for the first time? Either way, we'll assume that there was a completely innocent explanation for this call. For now. I personally don't think it was, but you'll have to tune in to episode 28 to hear all about that. Okay, so Charla gets off the phone at 3:20 a.m. Her phone, as far as we know, stays in Magnolia, Arkansas until that phone call to her boyfriend the next morning at 11:42 a.m. Back in 2005, the only way that we would know that someone moved their phone is if the phone made a call. It's not like today where you can go back and see where the phone was 24/7 through your Google or Apple Maps. I recently watched a documentary where the guy was caught because his phone was tracked by Google all over, even though he wasn't making any calls. But anyway, let's go back to 2005. Charla's phone stayed in Magnolia for all we know. But how about Charla? Of course we don't know where she was. She didn't have an ankle monitor or anything like that as far as I know. However, that longer than usual time between the last call of the night and the first call of the morning sure did look suspicious to me when I first read it. So let's see if Charla even had the time to drive to Roy City to murder her parents. The drive time from Magnolia, Arkansas to Roy City, Texas is 3 hours and 6 minutes. Multiply that by 2 and we have 6 hours and 12 minutes to go there and come back. And that's driving the speed limit. So she gets off the phone at 3:20 a.m. Add in that 6 hours and 12 minutes, and that takes us up to 9:32 a.m. 9:32 a.m. until that 11:42 a.m. call to her boyfriend leaves 2 hours and 10 minutes to be at her parents' house committing murder. Now, at this point, does that mean that we have enough information to slap on the cuffs and lead her down to the county jail? No, of course not. But what it does mean is that Charla Woodruff now has the opportunity to commit these crimes. When evaluating if a suspect is viable or not, most of the time you need to have motive, opportunity, and means. We have talked earlier in the season what her motives would be. Dennis was the one signing Charla into the psych wards involuntarily. Charla said herself that Dennis used to beat her so bad that the outline of his fingers would be on her body, and sounds like a pretty good motive to me. And of course, then we have the means. The means really wouldn't be difficult since all you really need is a kitchen knife and a piece of art/gun hanging on a wall. But again, all we know from the ballistics expert is that it was a large caliber gun. So who knows if or when she had access to any of the hundreds of thousands of 40 caliber or 45 caliber guns in the country. But it wouldn't be difficult to think she did. I mean, after all, as she and Ranger Collins both like to point out oh so quickly, she was a criminal justice major. The last thing that the attorneys are allowing me to talk about in regards to Charla's phone records is her interaction with some of the shit kickers in the days after the murders. From everyone I've been able to talk to, Charla did not know Mike, Joe, or Dusty well. Of course, she knew of them and had probably met them a few times, but remember, at this time in 2005, Charla was in her second year of college and really wasn't around much. She was friends with Mike's, Joe's, and Dustin's older brothers, but not the shit kickers themselves. However, the day after the bodies were found, Charla calls Dustin at 4:11 a.m. for 2 minutes. She then calls him again at 8:32 a.m. for almost 2 minutes, 9:13 a.m. for 30 seconds, and 10:20 a.m. for another 30 seconds. Now, normally, this would not be a huge deal, except, as we talked about, they were not friends. There were only 4 calls between Charla and Dustin, and they were all on this one day. None before and none after, at least not in these 21 days that we have. And they started at 4:11 in the morning. We will probably never know what these calls were about or why they were so weird, but we can only wonder. Just one more piece of the puzzle that we're trying to build. As Mike himself put it, quote, "Dude, there's a lot of juice to this story, and I think you haven't even broken the surface." End quote. Understatement of the year, but thanks, Mike, for your input. Okay, so the defense closes their case in chief with John Minor. So we'll talk just about one more thing. I played a clip in the teaser a few weeks ago. Let me play it for you again to refresh your memory.
Some of the evidence that I looked at was actually created by law enforcement. It looks like they received something from a mobile network operator legal compliance department, and then they created their own spreadsheets or whatever from that information. So we really don't know what they may have modified, whether they tailored the evidence to fit the crime or whether they just simply were blundering along. But in any event, it would be very normal for that type of evidence to be precluded from admission in a case. Any other type of evidence would be precluded if it were tainted such as that.
So what John Minor just told you is something that would eventually shake this case to its core. Just one more time that the state of Texas completely failed Brandon Woodruff. Not only did they fail him, but they actively sought to become incompetent at the very least, and at the very most, created an environment where the incompetence became nefarious and actually manipulated evidence to put an innocent man in jail. Okay, so as I explained to you previously in the season, the way evidence is treated in any trial, but especially in a capital murder trial, is very important. In other words, let's say you have a murder weapon. That piece of evidence has to have documentation and paperwork along with it so you know exactly who handled it, how long they handled it, and for what reason they handled it, etc. It's called in the legal world chain of custody. It's a huge deal. If it doesn't have a properly documented chain of custody, it can't even be used in the trial. Well, this piece of evidence, Brandon's phone records, was handled, or should I say mishandled, in such a way. The only problem is that technology wasn't available back then for the defense to realize what happened. Let's talk about a legal term that you might or might not have heard of before. It's something called, quote, best evidence. Here's the legal definition of what it means. Quote, the best evidence rule is a legal principle that holds an original of a document as superior evidence. The rule specifies that secondary evidence, such as a copy or a facsimile, will not be admissible if an original document exists and can be obtained. The rule has its roots in 18th century British law. End quote. Okay, so basically that means that if you have an original document, that needs to be turned over to the court to be used for evidence. So how does this apply in Brandon's case? Well, it turns out that what happened was the phone carrier sent Brandon's phone records to the U.S. Marshal's office as the court order told them to, but those records, or best evidence, were never turned over to the court. What Deputy Marshal Kirk King did was he created his own record or a copy of the records that he received. And as you just heard, they should never have been admissible in court. Now, the admissibility is just one aspect of best evidence. The other part of that is whether or not the information contained in the copy is true and correct and complete. As we all know by now, Brandon's records were missing about 14 hours on the day of the murders. Any other days? Nope, not the records we have. Just the day of the murders. Now, Deputy Marshal Kirk King tried to say that it was because he wasn't given all of the records from AT&T and Singular. The problem with that? How do we know? Because he never turned over those original records, or what we now know is best evidence. Just one more time, the state of Texas skewered any chance Brandon had of proving his innocence. And why is that? Because if it was found out that Brandon was at the Heath House during that 9:41 p.m. call to Morgan, that would prove beyond any doubt that Brandon did not kill his parents. And frankly, the state couldn't afford to have the jury hear that. So the motive for Deputy King to lie on the stand is insurmountable. It's absolutely disgusting. Okay, so at this point, the defense rests. This brings the trial in chief to an end. Next week, we'll cover the closing arguments by the prosecution and the defense. And then, the moment you've all been waiting for, we finally get to find out what the jury's decision was. I don't want to spoil it for you, but let's just say it doesn't turn out well for Brandon. You also will not want to miss next week because we will have the actual recording from the trial. I can't say who, but luckily for us, someone recorded the verdict and Charla's so-called impact statement, and you'll hear it directly from her mouth next week. Here's a sneak peek. Until next week, remember to stay aware, stay strong, and get involved. See you next week.
Are you bothered by this, ladies and gentlemen? Do the ballistics concern you? Does the lack of a gun concern you? Does the inconsistency of the knife with the wounds inflicted bother you? It bothers you because they haven't proved their case, and you have a reasonable doubt. Ms. McFarland mentioned a fantasy. This case puts me to mind of The Wizard of Oz in that scene where, after they killed the Wicked Witch, Dorothy and the Tin Man, they all come back to see Oz. And they've got the great big green floating head and the smoke and the flames, the big technological show. And little Toto is over in the corner pulling the curtain back on the truth. And the big green head says, "Pay no attention to the man in the corner. Look here, look here. Watch the big green floating head. Watch the technology. Watch the show." The truth is over off to the side. The state of Texas should have been a little Toto in this case.